2002, we all know that that's the year that the class size and composition wording was stripped out of the teacher's contract. And one of the government rationales for that move was to give the school districts more flexibility. Now, why do they need flexibility? Because in 2002, in the budget, the education budget was frozen at 2001 levels for 3 years. So that meant that there was no increase even for inflation. So it was cut every year for 3 years, and also costs went up in those 3 years. As we know, MSP rates have gone up a lot since 2001, and that's just one example of costs that boards need to pay, and they were getting less money to do it. So they needed flexibility. They needed to be able to make cuts. Under the funding model that existed in 2002, the ministry was responsible for funding programs. They were responsible for deciding what programs would be cut if cuts needed to be made. Now, last year, Katie Hislop of the Tyee wrote an article about public education funding, and she posted this old column that Mike Smith wrote in March 2002, in which he talked about a document that had been leaked to him, a cabinet document dated January 2002, when they made all these changes, and signed by Christy Clark, who was then the Minister of Education. And in it, the ministry staff sets out very clearly that because of this frozen funding, the government called it protected funding, but it was a freeze, education funding will be flat. And so the current, at that time, model wouldn't work. The ministry will be called upon to make decisions about which programs to cut or reduce in order to offset unavoidable cost increases. So responsibility for cuts would rest with the ministry. So that's a problem for the government. So they wanted to shift responsibility for cuts to the districts. And so they moved to a per-pupil model to give the boards the flexibility to make the cuts that the government knew were inevitable. As the Rural Education Task Force and Mike Smith warned, many schools have been closed in the last 15 years, and most of them are in rural areas. There's 251 of them have closed. Districts in areas like the Kootenays, the Cowichan Valley, Port Alberni, Prince George, Kitimat, Ashcroft, Kamloops, Thompson, the Peace, and the Caribou-Chilcotin have all seen multiple closures in small communities. And boards continue to have shortfalls despite all these closures that they've made, so schools continue to close. But now, by 2016, we're at the point where boards are flat out stating that they're closing schools in order to balance their budgets, and not because of low enrollment in those particular schools. This was a situation in 2016 in Smithers that we saw with the Kathleen Lake School, and in Osoyoos, where the only high school in town was slated for closure. It came very close to being closed to balance their budgets. Schools are the heart of communities in urban neighborhoods, just as they are in rural communities. Sometimes the shortfall can be made up with one-time cost savings. That's what Vancouver did for years, and Surrey did last year to the tune of $4 million. But other years, the shortfall must be made up by closing schools and or cutting programs and services, as we saw in Vancouver last year when they faced a $25 million shortfall because all the one-time funding had been used up. And the pressure to close schools is also high in urban districts because for years they faced this 95% capacity usage requirement in order to get seismic upgrading funding. So that's tied in there as well. Vancouver is predicting yet another shortfall for the coming year. And this year enrollment dropped by 206 kids, which is 0.4% of the approximately 50,000 kids that go to school in the Vancouver School Board. And it's spread across more than 100 schools, but it means for at least 0.4% less funding. And so, and also depending on how much costs go up, that's where you get your shortfall. And inflation alone is around 1.9%. So this photo that I have here is of a funeral that we had last summer when the school closures in Vancouver, potential school closures were announced. And the Parent Advocacy Network held a funeral where we listed off all 251 names of the schools that had been closed, and we rang a bell for each of them. And it was really quite something to hear all these names of all these schools and to know that each one represents a community that no longer has a school in it. So it's clear that per-pupil funding has been damaging to all school districts, whether urban or rural. It's the opposite of stable and predictable, and it does not allow districts to make reliable long-term plans. The Legislative Committee on Finance and Government Services has recognized this fact and recommended a funding formula review, but that's being ignored by government. Now Linda Larson is on the case, at least in the rural context, and we'll see what she recommends. But it's clear that we need to get rid of per-pupil funding in British Columbia. Thank you.